Well, welcome. Today's topic is a topic that I hope that will answer a lot of questions for you. It is on weed control in pastures, probably one of the biggest nemesis of anybody who has pastures because weeds just keep on coming. Well, let's just start off by talking about why on earth we even have weeds. And there's a lot of reasons for that, and some of them are listed here, but the weeds are plants that are simply out of place. If you put a rose plant in the middle of a vegetable garden, that's considered a weed. But the weeds that we are concerned about are those that generally are very prolific seed producers. And in a few slides, I'll show you just how many seeds some of these plants can produce in 1 year and why it's so important to control those. Weeds are also weeds because they have developed over time amazing mechanisms to spread, either attaching to our clothes or blowing in the wind, and as a result they get dispersed throughout fields very easily. Some of our weeds also have very long dormancy or viability, which means that they can be in the soil for many years and still come up. We also have genetic diversity that allows those weeds to adapt to conditions. Well, the other thing that weeds tell us, though, is it's a sort of an indicator of our management of that pasture and or other things that we may not be able to control. It might be an indicator of the fact that we don't have the right forage selection, or we didn't make any forage selection at all, that we didn't establish the pasture, we just adopted the pasture when we purchased the property. And it may not have the right grasses or legumes for that soil type or climate, and you might want to look at that. It could be also that there's too much shade. If there's a lot of trees or closer to woodlands, that can affect the quality of those forages. Sometimes it's just unfavorable soil conditions. Animals have a tendency to compact soil. If the soil is compacted, the forages won't grow well, and we will end up with weeds. In addition, if we have a high water table and some drainage problems, then the forage species that we want may not grow well in those areas, and weeds will come in instead. Once in a great while, the reason is just insects or diseases that have come in and affected our forage plants, and as a result, again, those diminish in quantity and the weeds take advantage of that extra light and space. We also have things like poor climate that can certainly affect pastures. Last year with the drought, we had a lot of concern about pastures and trying to bring them back after the drought. And last fall, we sort of had to baby them through that fall to help those pastures reestablish root systems so they would make it through this winter. And the fact that this is becoming a very long winter when it's 17 degrees up here in northern Illinois and end of March, that's rather difficult for pasture forages to make it through, and we may come out this spring and not have as dense a forage as we would have liked or would have wanted. And then lastly, as I said, a lot of times we have weeds simply because of poor management, things like not mowing improperly, fertilizing improperly, not having enough water, and so forth. So those are all possibilities. There are some weeds that we can look at in our pastures and get an idea of maybe why those conditions are not perfect. And if you simply do a search for indicator weeds in Illinois, you'll come up with a list like this. I just put a few in here that will also be available in the resources that I'll put out on our website a little bit later. But sometimes if you're just walking out there and you see something like goosegrass, well, goosegrass has an ability to grow well in compacted soils. So that's an indication that maybe we need to go in and do some renovation in that area. Other things like white clover, an indication of soil fertility and so forth. So knowing those key indicator weeds can help us get some hints on how to manage our pastures better. Real quick question again for you. Just if you think about how you're trying to control weeds right now in your pastures, any of these would be appropriate? Are you trying to use good grazing? Are you going out there with a hoe every time you walk in the pasture to hoe out those thistles? Or are you trying to utilize herbicides? Obviously, we're probably using all of those, but just an indication of the dominant one you try to use. Okay. Well, if we look at management of pastures, If we simply manage our pastures well, we actually can get about 90% good weed control, because what we're looking at is trying to get as dense a stand as possible. And so if you look at this triangle of pasture management and the different ways we can improve pasture management, the most important thing we can do is have the most healthy forage plants possible. And therefore, we would have a very dense forage that if you walk out into that pasture and you look down, you're not going to see any soil because those plants are growing so well. In addition, we want to do soil testing and making sure that we have the proper amount of fertilizer so that the plants can grow to the maximum. So that's the basis of good pasture management. Then there's some preventive measures that we can take, and I'll talk about those in a few slides, ways to keep weed seed out of the pasture. Then once we have our animals as a factor in that pasture, other things we can do is control our grazing to make sure we don't overgraze, and then also mow on a regular basis to prevent weeds from going to seed. All those things together are excellent ways to keep weeds out of the pastures. And as a last resort, then we do have our herbicides, which are pesticides that are designed to kill off weeds, or I should say plants, because if we don't use them properly, we could potentially kill off some of our pasture plants. And we'll talk about that when we get to broadleaf control. Well, for good pasture management, the first thing you do need to do is know what kind of plants we have out there. We hopefully have some forage species out there, and we'll talk about those in a second. And then if we do have weeds, we also need to identify what those weeds are, because it will make a difference on the method in which we choose to control them, whether it's by mechanical means or by using a herbicide. So identifying them becomes important. The pasture plants that we do want to see out there, at least in central northern Illinois and southern Illinois, you have a few more options. But the typical pasture plants in Illinois would be smooth brome grass, orchard grass, and Kentucky bluegrass. These are considered to be cool season grasses. So there you have their maximum growth in the cooler times of the year, in the spring and in the fall, and then are not as prolific growers in that July, August time frame. They also need quite a bit of nitrogen in order to grow well. We can provide that nitrogen either with fertilizers or in that pasture mix we can incorporate legumes. Legumes are plants that can fix nitrogen in the root system with the help of some bacteria. And those would be alfalfa, red clover, birds for tree sorrel is another one you might see. But these are usually mixed in as about 30% is what we normally are headed for in most pasture mixes in order to provide enough nitrogen for the grasses to grow as well. So those are the typical pasture mixes that are the plants that we would like to see in our pastures. Otherwise, we have weeds, and we need to be able to identify those weeds. As I said before, it's important to know the type of weed because that affects our herbicide choices. We have some herbicides that are designed to kill just what we call broadleaf weeds. Those are the ones pictured on the left, one example, where the leaves are rather large and the venation with them is rather netted. Then we have grasses where the venation in the leaves is parallel. And then we have a few pasture weeds that are grass-like weeds. For instance, yellow nutsedge, which I have pictured there. So we have some herbicides that can kill just the broadleaves. We have some that might affect just the grasses. But we also have some then that would kill anything that is green in that pasture. And so we need to select the herbicide correctly. And knowing the type of plant we have is one of the first steps. Once we know the type of weed we have, then it is important to know and understand the life cycle of that weed. And when does it start growing? And more importantly, or equally important, is when is it going to go to seed? Because whatever we do, we want to prevent these from going to seed. So scientists have divided these up according to their life cycles, and the 4 different life cycles. We'll go through each of them very quickly. For the first life cycle, we call these our winter annuals. These are plants that complete their life cycle in 1 year, but they are going to germinate in the late summer, early fall time period, grow, overwinter, and then the following spring and summer put out that seed head and eventually die. For these plants, they're important because a lot of times we don't even see them unless we're scouting well for them until the spring. And by then they're quite large and they don't respond quite as well for herbicide applications. It is best to control these in the fall if at all possible. And I've listed just a few of these. There's a lot more weeds that we might find out on our pastures, but things like chickweed, our mustards, a very, very common henbit, a rather purple plant. Horseweed is another one that tends to come up in the fall. So many of those are very, very common in our pastures. We also have summer annuals, and these are a group of weeds that complete their life cycle all in one growing season, which means they're going to start to germinate and grow in the spring, early summer. They will grow, produce that seed head during the growing season, and die back in that growing season. So the best time to control those, again, is in that seedling stage in the spring or early summer. Most of the time when we're going to find either the winter or summer annuals are in areas where that soil's been disturbed and that seed is exposed to light and allows those to germinate. They are best controlled in that very early seedling stage as soon as we can get out there and control them either by hoeing them out because they don't have much root system, they are very easily mechanically controlled, or using a herbicide. As far as the summer annuals goes, plants that complete their life cycle in a whole year, lamb's quarter, pigweed, those are really common in our pastures. Foxtail is another grass that might come up in our pastures, and there's a whole lot of others that I haven't listed here. The next type or life cycle of weeds are our biennials. And these are plants that complete their life cycle in 2 years. So they start off as a seed and they grow and they produce a rosette kind of structure and grow through the whole year. They produce like a taproot or an ability to overwinter with that root reserve and come back in the spring or early summer and produce a seed head and eventually die in that second year. So we're going to look at controlling those in that seedling stage or in the fall where that rosette is producing a lot of photosynthate and sugars and sending it down into that root system, getting ready for the winter. If we use a systemic herbicide at that time, then that will be carried down into the root system, kill off the root system, and that plant won't be back in the spring. Well, biennials can be rather aggressive, competitive plants in our pastures because of that root system. And I've listed a few here that you might recognize, particularly wild carrot, that's Queensland lace, yellow rocket's really common on our pastures. Teasel becomes more of a problem, and certainly thistles. Here we get into some of our thistles. Bull and musk thistle are quite common in our pastures. Sometimes some of these biennials are some of our toxic plants or have needles and so forth and are therefore less palatable. And that's another reason that they tend to do well in our pastures because the animals are not going to eat them and sometimes not even eat around them. Oftentimes we can find those weedy patches because the animals have left those areas alone, and that's where the grass is going to be a foot tall after they've grazed down everything else to a few inches. So the best long-term control for our biennials is to not allow these to go to seed and to cut those off, mow them off, or use a herbicide before seed production. The last life cycle then is our perennials. And these are plants that are definitely the biggest challenge in controlling. They started off as seeds. They grow, produce a seed head, and die back and overwinter because of the extensive root system they have, and the next year they'll be back again and they'll produce more seed heads. And unless you kill off that root system, you're not going to kill off this plant because that's how they survive. It's also how they spread. The root systems can be bulbs or rhizomes, which are long roots, and those, as a result, can create new plants during the growing season. For our perennials, we actually divide them into two more groups. One is herbaceous perennials, and those are plants that are primarily green, and all that green dies back during the winter and then comes back in the spring. So if you think about your dandelions in your lawn, those are good examples of herbaceous perennial. And I've listed quite a number of other ones that tend to be there. They're definitely a sign of the fact that those weeds have been there for some time, and the management of the pasture has not been the best if you have an abundance of these. The other problem with some of these, again, is that they can be toxic or not palatable to the animals, and that's why they're there, because they're not going to eat them, and so they can spread quite easily. The other main group of perennials are our woody perennials. These are much slower to establish. They are woody perennials because they actually develop stems or become more bush-like or even tree-like plants. So you see on the left there, I've listed quite a number of the vining kind of weeds that we have in pastures. Particularly Virginia creeper is one that we tend to have, a wild grape. And on the right side, more bush or tree kind of species that tend to occur in pastures. Multiflora rose, black locust are really common in pastures. For woody perennials, though, to establish, it means that they've been there for a while and that there's not been a lot of weed control in that area, because it takes a while for these to grow and become bigger. But it also makes them easier to control because it's a spot treatment of just that particular plant. When we look at the ease of weed control, the easiest to control are winter summer annuals, primarily because they only start from seed. And so if we can dig them out or kill them off when they're seedlings, then they're gone. The biennials do have that taproot, and so we can't just go and chop off the plant without affecting that taproot and killing that off. Otherwise, they could potentially resprout. The perennials, we have to kill off that root system. Otherwise, the plants will be able to come back. Just so you get an idea of what you're up against, I thought I would give you a picture of one of our not only weeds that are common in pastures, but this is actually one of our noxious weeds for Illinois. And this is a Canada thistle. These pictures were from University of Wisconsin. Jerry Dahl is a weed scientist, a retired weed scientist up there. He did an experiment where he took just 1 foot of rhizome, which is the root, and planted it in an area, and then left it for 2 years. And when he came back, that one little root had spread to an area of about 150 feet in diameter, and that's all Canada thistle there. It had shaded out and not allowed other plants to grow in that area. And then they dug down, and they kept digging down to about 5 feet and exposed the root system. That's the root system you're up against. In order for those Canada thistles not to come back, not to regrow, we have to in some way kill off that root system. And that's why herbicides become an important tool in pasture management. Or if you're going to do it organically, you're going to have to constantly reapply your method in order to actually deplete that root system of the sugar and plant reserves it has to begin a new plant. Well, how do we know when these plants are coming up and when we should go scouting for them? Because we do need to be out looking for weeds at least twice during the growing season. Here's just a chart from Central Illinois of the typical emergence times for some of our summer annuals. You'll see that in a typical year, I don't know that this March fits that, but our dandelions would be starting to come up from seed in March to early April, and some of them, like our nutsedge, doesn't emerge all the way until May. So this is not something that you just walk out once, say, okay, I've got all my weeds controlled, I'm done. Weeds can come up throughout the growing season, and then of course we have our winter annuals that will start germinating in August, September, and we need to be out scouting at that time as well in order to control them. So every time you put your animals out, that's something that you want to walk around a bit and see what are those weeds that are emerging. And you're going to look for the tiny little ones. You want to look, move the grass away and look at what is actually germinating. Some of the other weeds we want to control is not just because of competing with our forage plants, but also because they are toxic. The point of this webinar is not to talk about poisonous plants. It's probably a good topic for another webinar sometime. But there's certainly some of those out there that can be. Some of them will just cause chronic poisoning. They make the animals a little sick. Others can be acute poisoning. The symptoms that the animals show will also depend on the type of plant that is out there and that they've eaten, because the toxin can affect either the nervous system or the digestive system, and so it just depends on which poisonous plant is there. What I do know after 20-something years of managing pastures is that oftentimes when animals are getting into poisonous plants, it's because there isn't enough good forage for them to eat. And so if we can really manage our forage as well, one, we will have fewer weeds, hopefully fewer poisonous weeds, but also the animals will eat that grass that tastes really good and is very palatable, rather than being forced to eat a milkweed or some other plant that doesn't taste so good. So when we talk about poisonous plants, what's important is to, one, be aware of the plants that potentially could be in the pasture, and of course remove them when we see them, but also just to make sure we have really good forage so that animals are not forced to eat the poisonous plants. Just want to also make you aware that there are some weeds by law you are required to control if they're on your property, and they're called the noxious weeds. There's 10 of them. The main ones that we have a problem with in pastures are those thistles, the Canada and musk thistle, and sometimes the sow thistle is also there. Those are required to be controlled simply because they spread so easily. The Illinois Department of Agriculture is the one who monitors that, working with county boards. You can work with your local county weed control person for assistance if you need assistance in controlling those weeds. Well, we're talking about the importance of good management. Let's just go through a few things that we need to think about for managing pastures well. One is we want to maintain as high a forage density as possible. So when we walk out into our pasture and we look down, we shouldn't see any soil, because bare soil simply means that there's sunlight getting to that soil and the potential for the weed seeds then to germinate. So in order to maintain a really dense pasture, we do have to have the right forage species. So if you are one who simply adopted a pasture, finding out whether or not you do have smooth bone grass and orchard grass, or is it simply weeds that are out there? Because it might be the time to reestablish a pasture if you don't have good quality forages. Applying adequate and timely fertilizer is also really important. We usually recommend doing that soil sampling in the fall, but if you haven't soil sampled yet, you could potentially still do that in the next month or so. Send it to a lab, find out if any fertilizers are needed in order to maintain a good quality pasture. If there are bare areas out in the pasture, then you should think about reseeding those areas, getting some good quality forage and working that into the top of the soil after you've done adding the fertilizer and so forth, in order to bring back those particular areas. If it is because of compaction, the animals are always walking around those areas, it would be a matter then of having to do some actual tillage, perhaps getting some air back into that soil in order for that grass to actually take off. Something also that's important in maintaining good quality forage is clipping or mowing in between a grazing cycle. And I'm going to cover that a little bit more later, so I'm going to pass that by real quick. The other aspect of good pasture management is grazing management. And that is giving the forages a chance to rest in between grazing cycles, which means we usually recommend having at least 4 paddocks that the animals can be moved from one paddock to the next over a period of time, so that once you've taken the animals out, that pasture has about 30 days to recover, to grow a new root system, grow back about 8 inches tall before we put the animals in. And that way we avoid overgrazing, which eventually can kill off the forage plants. The other thing we recommend is a fall rest period. We want to let those forages get ready for winter, which means they have to reinvigorate that root system, get sugars and photosynthase down into the root system so they can overwinter. So usually up here in northern Illinois, that means that as of September 15th, we would take animals off the pasture and leave them off until the first frost. All those things will help that pasture make it through the winter, recover quickly, and start growing more quickly in the spring. We also need to look at problematic areas, all those watering areas, loafing areas, fencing off woodlands. Where those animals gather, they're probably going to compact the soil and prevent forages from growing. So we can either put gravel around those watering areas, make it more permanent, or move the watering areas around, have mobile watering tubs that can be moved from place to place every time we put the animals back in, anything to allow those forages to grow. The next step up from maintaining a good stand of forages is to prevent weed seeds from coming in. And some of the ways we would do that, obviously, is that healthy pasture, not having bare soil so that the weed seeds blowing in can't even get established. We also, when we are planting seed, we want to use weed-free certified seed so that we're not bringing in seed in that way. Other things to look at is not only our pastures, but what's around our pastures. Sometimes those fence rows or ditch rows have a lot of weeds in them. We may have to mow those as well in order to keep those seeds from coming into our pastures. So that's one thing to look at. Oftentimes our pasture areas are used as feedlots during the winter, and we're feeding hay. Some of that hay can have weed seeds in it, and so the other thing to look at is trying to get really good quality hay, very few weed seeds in it, if we're going to feed in those pasture areas. Another suggestion would be that when we're bringing new animals in, especially for boarding facilities, this is an important one, is to have those animals remain in one paddock for a while, clear out that GI system, because otherwise they might be bringing in weed seeds from the previous location where they were. Other things we can do is to just simply minimize any soil disturbance. Every time we expose the weed seeds to the light, they will start, they potentially can germinate. And I think the last statement is probably the most important. Just being very persistent is quite important in weed control. Mowing is another thing that we need to add on to our keeping weed seeds out of the pasture. Whatever we do, we want to prevent those weeds from going to seed. Mowing works very effectively, obviously, on weeds that are rather tall, something like red root pigweed. However, for our shorter perennial weeds, something like dandelion, mowing is not going to be the most effective. Timing does become critical to do this before they go to seed. And of course, it doesn't always work. Something like our lamb's quarter is one example where normally that plant is about a 3 to 4 foot tall plant, but if we start mowing it, it starts putting out branches more laterally and can still go to seed below the mowing height. If we are going to mow, the recommendation is to never mow lower than 4 inches. By having 4 inches of pasture forages, that's enough density there to keep the sunlight from hitting the soil. So we're going to only graze down, let the animals graze to 4 inches, and then go in and mow everything else to 4 inches to prevent weeds from going to seed. There's those slides I promised you just to get an idea of what we're up against again. Something like your red root pigweed, this is just one research study where one little plant can produce about 117,000 seeds in a growing season. Well, that's a whole lot of seed that then goes in the soil. And the bad part is the next slide, and that is their persistent survivability, the number of years that they can survive. Something like your lamb's quarter has been known to remain in the soil for about 40 years and then germinate. So whatever we do, we need to keep the weed seeds out of the soil because otherwise we're just adding work over time. Usually the bigger the denser the seed, the longer they can remain in the soil. So to keep the mowing to deal with the mowing some of our plants, if we're dealing with annuals, we definitely want to mow at the first signs of flowering to prevent those from going to flower. For our biennials, we prefer in the spring to mow at first when they're at bud to early flower, and then 3 to 4 weeks later to prevent them from bolting back again. Some of our thistles can come back and bolt. Otherwise, if we're going to go out and hand chop them off or hand hoe them out, we can't just chop off the top of the plant. We actually have to get down and chop about 1 inch below the soil surface into that taproot to prevent them from coming back up. For our perennials, if we're going to try to mow and control them, then you want to do that when the first flowers appear, and then spray when the regrowth is 18 to 24 inches later. If it's clipping, you might have to do that 3 to 4 times a year to prevent those from going to flower. Just think about your dandelions, how often you mow your lawn, and yet they keep on coming back and flowering and producing seed over and over and over. Well, the same thing happens in our pastures. Well, are there any biological controls? Is there any way to, any help out there for controlling these weeds? And there really isn't. Biological controls where we would bring in something to a live organisms to control one of our weeds. There are a few weevils and beetles that work effectively on our musk thistle. However, it's a very long cycle. It can be 5 to 8 years before you really see a difference. And you can look at the cost there. It's rather expensive, and there's no guarantee they're going to stay on your property. So it's not considered a really viable option. One option that does work for some of our shrub brushes is possibly goats. Quite a bit of research going on in this, and quite a lot of the research is rather promising. I'm just going to show you real quickly one of the research projects out of Missouri. This is, if you look in that center control area, that is what the hillside looked like before the research project started. On the left-hand side was an area of the multiflora rose, and they put just cattle in. Now, cattle are grazers. They eat higher up or lower at the grass level, whereas goats tend to be browsers and eat higher in the shrub level. And you can see on the right side that when you have the goats and the cattle, they were pretty good about going in and cleaning out that whole area. So one suggestion, perhaps, if you have a lot of shrubs and shrub brush, is to borrow someone's goats or raise them for a while until you can clean up those areas in a more biologically sound way rather than using the pesticides. Well, certainly pesticides are an option, and herbicides are pesticides that kill off plants. But there's some basic principles to follow if you're going to use a herbicide. One is you have to know what weeds you are trying to control, because not all herbicides will kill off all plants. And so identification is really important. I have a whole shelf of just weed ID books, and those are really valuable. The other ways is there's quite a number of websites. The University of Illinois has a website on weed ID. If you just do a search for weed ID, there's quite a number of websites available to help you do that. It is something that perhaps our master gardeners could also assist with, but if you're going to bring a plant in, you need to bring the entire plant to identify from the root system all the way up, not just a few leaves. So once we know the weed, then we can choose the right herbicide, and I'll show you one of the resources in order to choose that in just a minute. We definitely need to choose the right equipment. Obviously, if we've got just an acre, we're not going to bring in a big sprayer. We're probably going to have to spot spray. But the larger the pasture area, then the larger the equipment we can use. It is really important to calibrate that sprayer so we're applying the right amount of pesticide to those weeds so that it really is effective and it can control those weeds. It's also important to spray at the proper time. As we were talking about with the biennials, the best time to control biennials, the thistles, is in the fall when they're in that rosette stage. We're getting ready for winter. If you try and do the same thing once they've started to bolt, they will not be as effective. You probably won't kill off the plant at that point. And equally, I can't stress enough, is that the label has a lot of information on it. It is very important to read that label and follow it. And we will go through a typical herbicide label in just a moment so you can see the kinds of information that are available to you. There's a whole lot of herbicides available, and the active ingredient, the chemical that's actually doing the killing, is listed on the left side, but you can see on the right side that some of them are offered in different trade names. So in addition, on the left-hand side, you can see that sometimes there's combinations of the different active ingredients. In other words, the third one down, the dicamba 2,4-D, is combining 2 herbicides in order to have better control, perhaps, of certain types of weeds. So just going in and choosing a trade name is not necessarily as important as really knowing what is the active ingredient that is in that pesticide. That's also important when we come to trying to minimize plant weed resistance to our herbicides, and I'll explain that in just a minute. Well, how do you find out all the information? When I asked Erin Hager, our weed specialist on campus, where is the best resource for a list of herbicides that are effective on pasture weeds and approved for pasture weeds, he recommended going to the Pennsylvania Agronomy Guide, and that's the website that is there. Or you can simply do a search for the Agronomy Guide, University of Pennsylvania, and it will come up. Don't just print this, because this is about a 400-page document. The pasture management section is all the way to the end. But you can see, not in great detail, but one of the charts I have there is the pre-harvest or the grazing restrictions on one of the tables, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And then the one below is a table that lists the herbicide and then lists the different types of weeds, and it rates them from 1 to 9. So if it's a 9, it means that it's a very good herbicide to use to control that thistle or the lamb's quarter, etc. If it's a 1, you don't want to use that herbicide to control that particular weed. So that is why it's so important to know the weed that you're dealing with before selecting the herbicide. It is important to calibrate the sprayers and spray according to the label. For small paddocks, it is probably easiest to do a spot spray of the weeds, just going out and literally spraying each individual dandelion or thistle in order to get the best control. That can be time consuming, but it's one way to do that. Otherwise, you are sprayers that you can attach to your smaller tractors to spray on a more boom type of spray. And there are some companies, of course, who can come in and assist you with that if you so choose. It is important also to read the label to know what the grazing restriction is. On the label, it will state that if you are applying this pesticide for a pasture where, say, horses are there, it might have a 21-day restriction where the animals cannot go into the pasture again for 21 days. Other herbicides have no grazing restriction, so that is another thing to look at when you're choosing the herbicide. If you can't take the animals off, you're fairly limited on the number of herbicides you can use. We did talk about this a little already as far as the timing for herbicides. If you're going to spray annual broadleaves, the best time to spray them is in that early vegetative stage when they're just a couple of leaves large. For the biennials, it's in the rosette stage, late summer or early fall. And for the perennials, either in the spring, when they've just come up, exhausted that root system, in the bud to early flower, or in the fall regrowth period. It's the best time to use a herbicide to control those weeds. Some other things to realize is that the herbicides are designed to kill plants, not just weeds. And so if you have legumes, those alfalfa and red clover out in your pastures, and you just broad spray across that pasture, you can kill off your legumes, your alfalfa and red clover, unless you're going to spot spray and just hit the dandelion or just hit the thistle. So be aware of that, and that's part of the problem with like a boom sprayer kind of system. The other concern is that some of these herbicides are susceptible to vapor drift, which means if they're applied in summer when the temperatures are above 85 degrees Fahrenheit, they have the potential to be transformed into vapor gas, and then wind blow that gas off the pasture and into other areas. So if you have grapevines or tomato plants in the garden, there's a slim possibility that you could end up with a herbicide damage. So understanding which herbicides you're using, especially as you get closer to the hotter temperatures of summer, also becomes important to minimize that potential for drift. Plus, some of our herbicides can end up with a residue in the spray tank. So if you're going to use that spray tank for many different purposes, you want to make sure that it's cleaned out properly. So just read the label, because all that information is on the label someplace. Well, obviously, if we have legumes in the pasture, we don't want them to be killed. And so your options for that, one is just non-chemical management practices. You go out and hoe out any of the weeds that you have. If you're going to use a chemical, you have a potential of using a really low rate of the chemical and spraying it and just basically crossing your fingers that you're going to kill the weed and not the forage. There are other applicator types. There's something called a rope wick applicator, because oftentimes our weeds are taller than our forages. And so the wick or the ropes would hang down, and the herbicide is a concentrated form. It would hit the weed, not the forage, and you might be able to kill off some of the weeds then that way. But it's not a consistent manner to control weeds. The last thing is, if you have just weeds everywhere and very dense populations, would be to simply control everything. Go ahead and broadcast or broad spray the herbicide across the whole pasture, kill off all the broad leaves, leaving the grasses, and then come back in the early winter time, right about now. We would frost seed back into the pasture something like red clover to reinstate those legumes back into the pasture. Red clover is the main seed that works well for frost seeding. Alfalfa is not as effective because it's such a tiny seed. One thing we did want to share with you is just the concern that we do have for weed management, and that some of our weeds are becoming resistant to our herbicides. And the reason for that is that we tend to use the same herbicide over and over and over. And when we do that, then we end up with those plants being able to adapt, mutate to overcome and become resistant to the herbicide. So that when we use them again, we will get less and less control. So the recommendation is that if you use one type of herbicide one time, is to try and switch that active ingredient, that pesticide chemical that is doing the actual killing in it, so that we can hopefully kill off all the weeds the next time by choosing a different herbicide. So it's just a matter of rotating the chemicals that we're using, because it's very easy to just always use the same one over and over, and yet we can end up with, in fact, right now we have some ragweed in northern Indiana that is resistant to glyphosate, which is Roundup, and that's certainly something that we'd rather not have come over here into Illinois. The other thing is just to share very quickly is a concern for safety. Make sure you read the label. Usually the minimum clothing you want to wear when applying a pesticide are long sleeve shirts, long pants, a hat, shoes and socks, and then using unlined chemical resistant gloves when you're spraying. I share with you that I was just going to go very quickly through a label. If you've never had the delightful experience of reading one of these, there's a lot of information. But it's important to read, and especially if you're going to use the same chemical year after year, just realize that these labels do change sometimes. So just because you read it once doesn't mean that you shouldn't check it out again the next time you buy that chemical. And you should keep the label close to the bottle where you're storing it so that you have access to it and anybody else who uses it will have access to it. This is what a typical label looks like. It has information there. On the bottom left, you'll see that it lists the active ingredient as well as the common name of that. So you will know what is the actual chemical in that material that's doing the killing. So we can choose something different the next time we're going to apply. There's also the safety information there on how to keep it not only yourself but everybody around you safe. It does list in that safety section the personal protection equipment that you need to use, some safety precautions. For instance, don't wash your hands before eating lunch if you've been spraying pesticides. Equally important is the first aid. If by chance it gets in your eyes, if by chance somebody drinks it, how do you treat that person before you get them to the doctor? Very important section to read before you even buy the herbicide is this section on the weeds that it actually controls. On the label, it should state which herbicides or which weeds that particular herbicide is best at controlling. And it needs to be on the label in order to use that in the pasture. There is a section for environmental hazards. If this pesticide is susceptible to that vapor drift or could potentially contaminate water and wells, there is information usually in this section about that. The directions for use gives you a lot of information on how to store the chemical properly, how to dispose of the containers properly, as well as the directions and the rate of that you would use to mix the pesticide properly. The use section gives you a lot of instructions on the different ways to utilize this. In other words, if you are going to use a wick versus a spray, what's the different concentrations that you would apply this with? If you're going to use as a pre-emergent versus on the leaves of the plant as a post-emergent, the rates might change. Up here in the right-hand corner, there's some information on that grazing restriction, how long the animals have to stay out of the pasture. In this case, it's 14 days. It states for some animals, not all animals. And of course, in the application rates and all the different calculations that you can do to apply that pesticide. In this case, because it is susceptible to drift, there's information on preventing drift when using this particular herbicide. The other fact sheet information I wanted you to be aware of about pesticides is what we call an MSDS sheet. It's a material safety data sheet. It's also available on the web if you just do a search for the name of the pesticide and MSDS. What this sheet does is it gives you a lot of background information about the particular pesticide, especially about the safety information and long-term potential impacts of using a particular pesticide. Well, we have gone through a lot of information faster than I had planned because of the problems with technology, but that's just life these days when we use technology. But I did have one last question to ask you, and I'd be glad to take questions from you. And we'd like to just understand a little bit where you are at in your pasture management. So as a result of coming to this webinar, what is the one thing, or where are you going to step in and start to control your weeds in a different way? Are you going to just start off by identifying the plants? If you've never done that before, that's where you'd start. That would be A. B would be you're going to start, I know what my plants are, I'm going to have a grazing plant and not overgraze, mowing properly, or using a pesticide. So if you could take a moment and think about that, where you're at in your pasture management, I'd be grateful. Well, just a quick summary, and then I'd be glad to take your questions. I hope this has been helpful. I hope the point that if you simply maintain a good quality pasture by having adequate fertility, maintaining good dense stands, stopping weeds as soon as you see them, making sure you're grazing properly, not overgrazing, going in and mowing as soon as you take the animals off to prevent weeds from going to seed, then you can go a long way to minimizing weed problems in your pastures. If you do have weeds, it's really important to control them before they go to seed so they don't spread. I just want to give you a couple last resources. If you wanted information on how to do soil testing, we do have a list of soil testing labs on our University of Illinois Extension website. If you simply go there and do a search for soil test labs, that website will come up, and it lists labs that do testing for pastures. Any of the labs that have a C by them would be appropriate for that. At our publications office, we do have a CD available on pasture management. It's for horses. It's geared for them, especially the poisonous plant section, but any of the information there might be useful to anybody trying to establish a rotational grazing on their property. I told you I'd refer you to a really excellent resource for identifying those grasses in your pasture. We have an excellent little handbook. It's only 3 by 5. It's called Identifying Turf and Weedy Grasses in the Northern United States. Not very expensive. I think it's $6.60 the last time I looked at the price. But I do think out of all my shelf of books on identifying plants, this is the best one that's available. And the reason for it, it gives really clear pictures of identifying the grasses. Now this is only for grasses. It won't help you with the broadleaf plants such as your lamb's quarter and pigweed and those kinds of plants. Other information we have at the University of Illinois is out on our Illinois Trail, Livestock Trail website. There's some information about pastures as well as for the different species of livestock that you might be wanting to produce. And check that out. Nationally, we have our e-extension website, and it's just a tremendous amount of information on horses, goats, sheep, beef, dairy. And for those folks who then are coming in from different states, that might be a more useful tool, because if you log in there, they will bring up the information from your state first, and then refer you out to publications and information from other states. So check that out. And the last thing I want to make you aware of is that the Natural Resource Conservation Service in Illinois does have an Illinois Grazing Manual. It's all downloadable off the web, and we'll have resources and information about how to begin a grazing program. I do know we have a few folks who are interested in organic pasture management. Jerry Dahl has a nice publication up in Wisconsin on weed control without chemicals in pastures. As I said earlier, if you're going to control weeds without using a synthetic herbicide, basically 2 different ways. One is to mechanically remove those weeds, go and hand weed them out with a hoe and so forth. There are a few organic herbicides approved for pasture management, but those are what we call contact herbicides, which means they will only kill off the top part of the plant. It will not affect the root system. So if you're going to use those, you will need to go back out in the pasture a week or so later. You'll see that regrowth starting on that plant, and you need to spray it again. And so by spraying on a regular basis, you will eventually deplete that root system and will eventually kill off that weed. But also be aware that it's not selective. Those are contact herbicides that will kill anything that the spray gets onto that leaf. So you have to be really careful how you spot spray the weeds in those situations. But this publication is also very good about giving some suggestions on, again, basically good pasture management helps control those weeds. With that, I'd be glad to take any questions. I'm seeing a few over in the chat pane, so I will go ahead and go back up to the top and try and begin to answer some of those. I've seen that James has helped me out, I think. From Kankakee, it says, lamb's quarters are known to be an edible plant. What is the disadvantage of allowing aforementioned to grow in a pasture? Well, that is a good point. There are some weeds that are actually, it's not that bad of a problem to have out there in the pasture. Wisconsin's actually done some research with quackgrass. Now, quackgrass is a very invasive weed that we normally try to get rid of, but it actually is also a very good forage plant. So it's a possibility to have those there. The main disadvantage of weeds is that they don't tend to have much leaf material on them. And so if we're trying to use that pasture as a way of feeding our animals, we need a lot of leaf material in a very small area so that they can consume enough to gain weight or grow properly. If we have too many weeds out there like lamb's quarter, there's not that many leaves for a lot of stem, not much nutritional value compared to if we had, say, that orchard grass plant growing. The next question was labels list herbicides contained in blending the herbicides. Are new compounds created? It's just a mixture of those together. It's not a new compound necessarily. Hemp dogbane perennial, have controlled by mowing patches very short in order to exhaust it. Any other recommendations? Outside of the herbicides, there are some herbicides that are quite effective against it. I would go and look at that list in the Pennsylvania publication. Hemp dogbane is listed there, and there's a number of herbicides that are rather effective. But that is one of the more difficult ones to control. Again, there's not much leaf material, so when you're spraying the herbicide, it's hard to get good coverage on that one. If there's any other questions, I'd be glad to answer them. Otherwise, thank you so very much. Okay. We had a question from our room that when they laid out the pasture, they put out various trees around a border of around the pastures, including autumn olive, and I had listed that as one of the problem weeds. And the main problem with that is the berries it produces. It can spread quite readily. So I'm not sure that that's one I would have put around a pasture. It definitely is good for wildlife feeding. That is true. Yeah, I'm sure that's why they put that out. It's more as a wildlife habitat. No, it's not poisonous in that. So, but it can be a problem. It can spread readily. If you have any other questions, I'd be glad to take them. Otherwise, thank you so much. The question is, are there plants in the USDA pollinator mix that are not wanted or weedy for pastures? It has been probably 2 years or more since I've looked at what is in that pollinator mix, so I'd have to go back and look at that. I would suspect, since it's a pollinator mix and you are wanting that to go to, flower and go to seed and for the pollinators, that there's probably something in there that might be a problem, but I'd have to go back and look at that. Is it possible to lightly disc in an established pasture hay field to help get rid of tracks or bumpy grounds? Best equipment to use and what time of year? Trying to avoid starting it all over. That is really a tough one because if you any kind of tillage is going to leave that surface rough. If you're really going to try, one option would be to do a chisel plow through it. A couple of times that tends to just lift the soil and puts it back down and gets rid of some of that compaction. The bumpiness is one of the most difficult ones to get rid of, and it often ends up with people just reestablishing it rather than trying to constantly even out that ground. But I would try a chisel first, be prepared to overseed with a good quality pasture mix. The other thing you would do is to mow that down fairly close to the ground so that that new seed has an opportunity to get up and get established before the grass starts to regrow. So, and you can email me if you want more details. I could provide you a little bit more information or give you a call. Thank you so much.